You don't have Dunkin' Donuts in the UK, do you? Or do you? Maybe in
I've
London.
heard Dunkin' Donuts. It's again like one of those classical American things that I don't think we have Krispy Kreme here.
That's astonishing.
That's
actually
fairly recent though. I'd say we've had it in the last 6 years, but now it's like everywhere. Like there's like a section in a supermarket, like end of an aisle, is like a Krispy Kreme stand. But yeah, I'd say it's the last 10 years that's appeared. It certainly wasn't around when I was a kid.
I never knew anything about Krispy Kreme until I moved to the South, where their claim to fame is when they're making the donuts, they have the sign on. They have their sign lit up saying like hot donuts or whatever. And you can go in and watch them make the donuts, and the donuts go through the thing, and they get the sugar all put on them. And I'm sure there's a correlation between diabetes rates in the southern U.S. and Krispy Kreme. Oh, Wendy's tired. Whynde,
I'm tired. Did you say?
I don't know. I mean, this is what you need, right?
I only have hotel coffee.
Consultant saying things. Fueled by Dunkin'.
Awesome.
Consultants run on Dunkin' is, I
That's
think,
right.
the line you were looking for.
Yeah. That's
So
right.
what was entertaining when I joined this was my name on the thing showed us Whynde Kuehn, and I was like,
How did I do that?
and I remember why, because last time we were messing around calling ourselves Whynde Kuehn.
Of course.
We all changed our names. That's right.
I love this topic so much, Phil. I have so many thoughts, but I feel like I actually have no coherent thoughts. So
That's good. Chris will clean it up in the edit. I mean, that's what I love about this. You just shit talk for 45 minutes, and he comes up with 20 minutes of, and you sound like a genius when he's done.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah.
What do you have for breakfast, Chris?
Fantastic news, everybody. I just secured a new sponsor.
Oh,
Yeah, Echo is gone, so maybe having more people with
Consultants run
headphones
on Dunkin'. I'm telling you, that's
Consultants
the
run on
line.
Dunkin'.
That's
Yeah.
the line.
By the way, I was thinking that exact thing in the shower earlier.
Oh my God, don't. I was going to say for you, I mean, unless you're planning on singing and accompanying yourself with your, go grab that ukulele out of the background and sing and dance.
All right, turning it off. I'm turning it off. But maybe
So,
everyone needs to chat.
I noticed a little unsightly. My book pile is getting larger. It's not getting smaller. No matter what I do, I can't get ahead.
I noticed you have your books on their privacy setting. We can't see the spines and say,
Yeah.
oh my God. Apparently, I didn't even know there were books on erectile dysfunction, but Chris has got a whole stack of them.
Right next to 50 Shades of Grey, yeah.
Awesome.
So,
Yeah. Well, Phil, that's a hard one. But
oh,
but-
nice. Softcore books on.
should
I'm
we
not sure
record
what
an
book you-
episode?
No. Oh, that's up to you.
I don't feel like it.
Look at that. Oliver can adjust how much
Well,
Oliver
it's
we
'cause-
see.
This is the
I
Lumix S5.
I hope it's the
Whoa.
Zoom, right?
Wow.
Go all the way in?
Oh,
No,
fantastic.
no.
Look at this.
Oh,
Don't do it.
Oliver.
Don't
Hey,
do it.
kids,
Don't do
more
it.
Oliver.
Look at the
Don't do it.
resolution on that. That's fantastic.
Yeah, this is a
That's
it's,
Wait a
Your
second.
Nikon or
no, it's a Panasonic Lumix.
Just
yeah,
make
no
it-
kidding.
I want to see if this still works. I haven't done this in a long time.
Hold on. Ready? All at once.
It's automated. Ready?
Yep. 1, 2, 3. Whoop.
Awesome.
Since putting these headphones on, I'm now feeling too warm in this jumper. So
Yeah.
anyway, it's fine.
All
We'll
right.
get along with it.
Do you need
Jumper.
to disrobe?
A jumper.
Did you call
I
it
like it.
jumper? I love that.
It's actually a hoodie, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
It is. Yeah.
Yeah.
It is.
I love
But,
a jumper,
yeah.
though.
Do you need to disrobe, Oliver? Will you be
Yeah, I am going to. Give me a moment. Sorry.
soon? All right. Okay.
How many more prevarications can we have?
Let's zoom in for this one.
No,
Perturbations,
no.
prevarications.
You do not want to see my beer crate. Not a six-pack, unfortunately. It's a crate. So
It's a keg. We call it a keg here. It's not a 6-pack. It's a keg.
Shall we
Should we-
start?
So afraid I have nothing good to say. We're only recording a cold open today. Only cold open.
This is for all the other episodes.
Someone pick a new topic. Yeah.
The episode will be 30 seconds long, and the cold open will be 45 minutes.
That's
30
right.
minutes.
Right.
It's the way we like it.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Consultants Saying Things. I am Chris Lockhart. I'm joined today by, we've got Phil Yanov, we've got Whynde Kuehn, we've got Oliver Cronk. We're all here together. I want to talk today about ego, right? So ego, ego can be sort of like the enemy of a good workplace environment, right? And, certainly in the US, like when you say someone has that guy's got an ego, right? It sort of carries this negative connotation. I think there are other things about where having an ego could be a hindrance. There's also this thing that maybe in certain job roles, maybe certain types of ego maybe are positive things, right? So I want to get first into this, because I think there's a question of exactly sort of what do we mean by ego. But Phil, I know you've been thinking about this a little bit more than maybe the rest of us have, so I wanted to get your hot take on it.
Wow, man, I love the pitch. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, Phil.
Ooh.
I mean, look, you've got more ego troubles than anybody we know.
Phil,
Let's get started with you. Yeah,
let's go large
after all those therapy sessions, Phil, has that done you any good at all? Yeah. No, I think that's a thing, right? I mean, and what I mean by that is we have certainly seen ego gone wrong. The good news is if we're looking for bad examples, there are lots of Mr. and a couple of Mrs. bad examples out there on egos gone awry. But this is, ego is the sense of self. And when it goes wrong, it means typically we have an inflated sense of self, right? It means we think more of ourselves than is good for us as we try to interact with others. And that's why I thought this would be a great topic for us, because as we talk to consultants about how they navigate their world, they're going to find that they work with clients that have big egos. They're going to work with coworkers that have big egos, or partners that have big egos, or maybe even, and this is the one we're really hoping to help, is maybe they themselves occasionally have an unchecked ego, and they got to figure out how to get that into its right size so they can work and play well with others.
Yeah, and I think, listen, it's about that self-awareness, right? About what am I projecting in terms of how I come across, and how is that helping or hindering? But I think the first question I have is what do we mean by ego, right? And so we've got I talked about sort of maybe the North American perspective of being negative, but I mean, Whynde, what is ego? Does it mean something different in a Norwegian context, perhaps? I don't know.
Well, that is actually a particularly interesting question if you ask it from a Norwegian context.
I try,
Because there's actually an idea called janteloven, which is very rooted into the culture of the country. And the idea of janteloven, just in my own words, is sort of, don't think too much of yourself. Don't try to rise above the rest, right? It's kind of about, fitting in and being humble. So great example of culture embracing not having ego for the good of society and how we all show up.
Oliver, is there a British context?
Yes, I think there is. But I love what Wendy's just talked about. So let me just jump on the Scandinavian thing briefly, because I see that model. I mean, we've talked on this show a number of times about regional differences between the US, Europe, and say Scandinavia. And I think, you look at Scandinavian culture, and there is very much a community. You look at the politics, you look at the whole society. It's far more about community, and I guess that's because in Scandinavia, there's more extremes of temperature and weather, and therefore perhaps the community has been more vital for people to survive. Perhaps in the US, it's been possible to be a little bit more self-sufficient. So yeah, I think ego is a really interesting thing when you kind of look at culture. And in terms of the British, to your point about British, I think I think we like to think we don't have ego, and I think it goes against our culture when people do. And you look at our leaders recently, who have been full of sort of bluster and almost come across as buffoons because of the way they kind of come across, and they believe in their own self, or what's coming out of their mouth more. Not enough around understanding what people are saying and connected with reality. So I think the stiff upper lip thing applies in Britain as well, right? That's kind of very much sort of traditionally been about our sense of self, and we've kind of kept things to cards close to our chest, etc. So it's not something I think traditionally we've spoken about openly, but I think from a British consulting firm perspective, certainly we can talk about some really interesting things there around sort of the partner model and how that sort of plays into building up thought leaders and egotistical sort of stuff. So there's a bunch of things we can discuss here. I'm looking forward to this one.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that you talked about, right? The stiff upper lip, because that would imply, right, that the ego is there, it's just controlled, or it's below the surface, or in other words, is that how
it's doing its job, isn't it? Isn't that what we thought the ego's real job was, to negotiate between those other levels of our personality, right?
Yeah. Well, and that's what I'm wondering, right? Is like, how do you know when it's out of control? How do you know when is it when it's visible?
During your 360, I think it normally comes up during the review process, right? Someone tells you, hey, Chris, I don't know. Hey, Chris, wait a second. You wrapped around us, but you know what? As a Canadian, don't you have some ideas about, aren't there some cultural things about this?
Sorry, I can't talk about that.
Exactly.
You have a whole identity crisis if we talk about this.
Yeah, I know. I think, look, from a Canadian perspective, right? I mean, not to get into geopolitics, but I mean, Canada always sort of feels overshadowed by its much larger, louder neighbor, right? And so I think it tends to get caught up in that, like, oh, Americans are egotistical. Oh, it's just a much larger, population, and you tend to just sort of get overshadowed by something like that. So I don't, is that when you think about, like, okay, well, what does a Canadian ego look like? I'm not I'm not sure you could detect one, to be perfectly honest with you. I mean, I'm sure it's there, but it's sort of like,
Are there not French influences in the Canadian?
Well, I wasn't gonna stir up.
Who else can we throw under the bus here?
Call the State Department before I say anything.
Yeah. So here's the thing, this whimsical overview, right, of how the world looks, I think is useful because we come at this from different cultural points of view, and we have certain things built into us that, I mean, everybody does, right? And American exceptionalism, we don't even have to define that or explain it. People get it, right? We're here to save the day. But I think knowing that we have all of these ideas to begin with, knowing that people come to this differently, can explain some things about how we have to sensitize ourselves a little bit, not just to us, but to the people around us, about what angle they're coming at the problem from, and why their ego might not be dialed into a perfect 5, if that's the right number, right? But they're not dialed in to that number in the middle. It might be too big. It might be small. And by the way, I think that's a kind of a weird one for us to work on. But usually, even if it's dialed in too big, right, too large, it means they can find themselves at the top of the heap or the bottom. Like, they're using their exceptionalism to go, woe is me. So it can manifest itself in a variety of ways. But having control of this helps us control ourselves and helps us work with others better.
Well,
and that's why we wanted to talk about it.
So how do we know when it's getting in the way? In other words, how do we know, Phil, if we're level 5 ego versus DEFCON 2 or whatever? How do we know where the ego is actually?
It should be on the Richter scale. Can it be
Richter
scale? Can we use the Richter scale for this?
The consultant ego scale. Yeah, but how do we know when it's actually out of whack or out of sync for the context? Because I imagine it can vary by context, right? If I was to go to Norway, right, I would have to dial in to a different ego setting, probably, right, than if I'm going to go to Texas or something, right, where that's, of course, everything's bigger. But, how do we know when it's a problem? How do we know when we're not dialed in at the right setting?
Yeah. So first off, let's in among us, the four of us, right? Let's do a quick survey. Raise your hand if you've ever met someone whose ego was out of check for the situation in which they were in. Have you ever been in a professional situation? Okay, so here's the deal. We all know it when we see it, right? We all know when this problem has gone wrong. And there's usually some cat that's like not letting everybody be part of the conversation, or is basically not allowing certain things to come forward. And being sensitive to that myself, I want to ask Whynde Kuehn that thing. I mean, Whynde, I think you bring a unique perspective to this. And I would love to hear you talk about how you've seen this go wrong first. And then we're going to get to how can we get the right questions in the room so that this gets back in check again.
And Phil, I think it's such a good point, because you're right. Actually, as humans, we can feel when someone is out of sync with the room, if they're overbearing or not connecting with the people. There's just something human that I think we sense in others. I actually think the best way to identify if your ego is out of check for the situation is indeed that looking at other people. I think about, sometimes I'll hear someone say, wow, everybody in my life is angry, or everybody in my life is trying to take advantage of me. And I think there's very much a matter that we attract and we create the people that we're around. So the best way to really understand that is to just sort of look at look at your life, look at the people reacting, and then adapt from that. And it's always small course correcting as well. And I think asking for feedback from trusted people as well.
So if I can jump in for a moment, I think this is closely connected in with our previous episode on mental health. For those who haven't checked that one out, I think there is definitely a relationship between being self-aware enough, because often I think the people with the ego challenges aren't perhaps self-aware enough to understand the impact they're having on others. And so this is the thing for me. I think you need some degree of, I think if you want to get ahead, you want to be a leader and you want to sort of get your point across, you do need some degree of self-worth. You can't be a shrinking violet. You need to better be confident about yourself, but it's kind of keeping that in the right sort of happy space that allows others to contribute, as we sort of touched on already, I think is important. But I think the other mental health aspect of this, before I shut up and be less egotistical, is often if people are displaying some of these attributes, it means sometimes they're masking for other stuff that's going on in their world, in my experience. So I've had interesting characters that I've had to deal with, and unless you understand and empathize with what's going on, you don't understand why they are behaving the way they're behaving. And it's often because they've got a difficult thing going on at home, or there's something else going on, and therefore they are overcompensating at work, and they are kind of letting off steam inappropriate at work, but it's coming across as being very egotistical. Oh, just get this done, or this is what we should do, da, 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 da. And it's because perhaps there's other stuff going on in their world that people aren't aware of. And sometimes some of these things can be useful kind of clues to sort of have a real conversation with someone about what's going on.
But of course, through all this, right, we're talking about self-awareness, high EQ, right? All of these things, right? But there's also, there's a clinical definition of ego, right? That, I mean, none of us are qualified to speak on, but there's sort of what a psychology major might say, right? Which is, there's, I don't know what they would say actually, but maybe we need an expert to tell us about the ego and the id, right? I mean, I think it's this whole thing about like having that balance. So I don't know if we're really just talking about, back to the, what is it, Phil, where we said just be a good human being, right? Sort of thing, right? Being aware, self-aware.
Yeah. Well, no, I think that's right. And, Oliver touched on some important stuff there that I think, is that when we see this person, if the person happens to not be us, right? But when we see this person who is acting inappropriately in this space with what feels like a really inflated sense of self, right? The ego, that they are also fragile. They are frequently fragile, and it doesn't take much to pop that. And so that is another danger that's in the room, right? Yeah, I mean, I don't, we're not, as everyone has already pointed out, we're not healthcare professionals here. We're not trying to give you the answers to all of these things. What we're trying to do is kind of give you some guidelines that you can use to work and play well with others, and to make sure that you've dialed in your own sense of self so that it works with others. Let me tell you, I don't know, and I'm open to anybody else's ideas on this, but I don't think you can walk into a room with other consultants and your clients and say, I think the egos are a little out of whack in this room, and we ought to do something about that. That will not be well received. So please don't come away with the idea that that's what we're trying to get.
Meeting agenda topic number 1. Let's get our egos in check, everybody.
I got real problems with you people.
That's right. So all right, in the vein then of trying to be helpful to people, dare we give some examples of maybe where we've felt ourselves not dialed in, and maybe how that has, maybe what we've learned from that? Is that useful?
I was sitting here thinking, like, I have busted some relationships with a bad ego. I'm going to tell you, I'm just going to, volunteer that has happened, but I'm not actually going to tell you the stories attracted to that, because I can tell you the name,
for another
but not
time.
the tale. But that's for another time. But the thing is, I think about places where it's gone wrong, where the problem was me. I mean, there are just times that I know that what happened there was I didn't have me dialed in, and that's what blew up the professional relationship or the personal relationship that I had. So, I'm just in case anyone else is having trouble admitting that to themselves, there are times that I've been the problem, and that's
I was going to volunteer to go first.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks.
But no, I mean, listen, I mean, there's lots of times, and Shashi's been around for a variety of them over the years, right? Where it's, for whatever reason, I don't think I'm being treated at the same level that I, in my mind, think I should be treated at, right? And what kind of behavior does that cause? Anger, right? It causes disdain, right? It causes all sorts of behaviors that are just self-destructive, because the minute you start going down that path, right, the cats you're around are just kind of, well, F that guy, right? And you don't actually get to the direction that you want to go. I mean, I could give quite a few examples of that, actually. Right?
I mean, I think I've spoken about this before, right? I'm pretty sure I spoke about how earlier on in my career as an individual contributor, who in my 20s thought I was God's gift to software.
Oh, you are, Oliver. Come on.
Awesome.
Before he goes into this, can I just tell you that when you do the full screen on Oliver, he's a handsome dude. That new camera is really making this. I mean, look at this Oliver.
Right
oh
there.
My gosh. Yeah. Look at that. I mean, he's a handsome dude. I'm just going to say.
Yeah.
All right.
All right. We'll zoom back out.
Yes, thank you. So yeah, I mean, I think but the problem I touched on earlier is that you need to be aware of this. But I think that was my major problem, was I didn't mean any harm. I was just trying to push things forward. I was trying to do the best work I thought I could do, but it was rubbing people up the wrong way. And I think the clues for me with hindsight were being dragged into too many HR style conversations around, why aren't you playing nicely with this project manager? And I think I talked about this before, right? So I think there are sometimes fairly obvious clues that you are just sort of completely out of touch. And I think, to Chris's point just now, it's to the degree to which you're just completely out of check with your version of it's perception versus reality, I think, isn't it? It's like what you think is the way you're coming across, or the way you should be treated in a situation is, and there's a degree of entitlement kind of coming in here as well, right? Oh, I feel like, I should be listened to, or everyone should just follow what I'm doing. And I think in a consulting organization, sometimes this is hard, right? Because the roles aren't always crisply defined. There isn't always a nice racy matrix or something that says, right, you are in charge of this or whatever. And there's sometimes a bit of a bun fight, a bit of a scrabble to kind of claim a project or a direction on something. So, or client sort of buy-in on things like that. So I think for consultants, it's particularly challenging, particularly as you often deal with very charismatic individuals who've built successful consultancy practices that you're then part of, and you potentially model those behaviors because you see, oh, well, my leader is behaving like that, so I should do the same. And the reality is that's not often appropriate at a more junior level.
Mm-hmm.
Anything to
say,
share, Wendy? Any
yeah,
juicy stories
yeah.
when your ego is out of check?
I don't know how juicy, but there are a lot of examples here. But I think cultural is one of them. Just being in different places and getting that whoa instant feedback, like, okay, that was not cool, that was not accepted here. Got it. Get in a different mode. But I think my ego moments derive from a having to be right or wanting to be right versus wanting to be about the bigger thing that we're doing together. So, that may show up as, all right, Wendy's going into teaching mode or academic mode. But I think I've realized there's times to turn that on. There's times to do that. And then there's times just to have conversation and, bring all the ideas together for the greater good and for allowing people to interact with ideas on their own, which they learn better anyway.
Yeah, and Oliver, you pointed out, right, that for consultants, I think this is particularly difficult because I think one of the knocks, right, on one of the tells of a out of check ego is I am the only one that can do X, right? And if I leave, this whole thing will fall apart, and they had better, I'll show you, and all this sort of stuff. And 99% of the time, that's 100% not the case, right? 99, is that I just invented something. 99% of the time, it's 100% not the case. But do you know what I mean? It's like the world will go on, right, without you. But consulting, in particular, does sort of reinforce this notion that without the guy that knows everything about Snowflake, without that guy on the project, we're screwed, right? And so there is sort of this notion that I am the center of this thing, and if I go away, so you'd better treat me the right way.
And
I think
I
that's a problem.
I think there's a couple of things to unpack there, particularly around technology consulting, where perhaps there are limited numbers of individuals that do know some of these topics, but also the clue is in the word consultant, right? Consult. I mean, I always like to say it's as much because you're using your ears. I can't point to them because I've got these headphones on, but you should be using these, more than this, and that's sometimes difficult when you're trying to perhaps establish rapport, establish sort of buy-in and recognition that the firm that you represent has got thought leaders or knowledgeable people, good people, but you also need to be engaging and listening to your client. So there's a lot of things to balance in that consulting gig, particularly in the technical consulting gig.
And not to point out the obvious, but the consulting model, our livelihoods are based on this, unless you're doing consulting in a different way and getting results in a different way.
Yeah. And I mean, how many times in a proposal or something, you peg someone as, well, this is the expert in whatever, right? And it's like, talk about filling someone's head with the idea that they're indispensable. You're telling the client they're indispensable. It's like you're selling them as indispensable in a way, right?
And that they have to rise to that, which gets to Oliver's point earlier about like you have these insecurities and you show up even more as ego.
So, I mean, I want to talk about because Oliver, you said it earlier, and I think this is really interesting. And if the ego's out of check, okay, so let's just say you're at a 7 and the situation calls for a 5 or whatever. Just making up a new scale, but is that like Whynde? Is that overcompensating? Is that someone trying to step up and they're overshooting where they need to be? Is that like is the ego really just the manifestation of someone being really uncomfortable, right? And so they're emoting, right, a little bit more maybe than they would.
Perhaps yes, but I think there's also maybe it's values, maybe it's culture, but I think there's intentionality on how you want to show up. And just to give a personal example, I am American. I used to lead a really big team. At the same time, I was spending time in Africa with this group of fellows, these Desmond Tutu fellows. He lends their name to this, to these young leaders. I learned leadership in a very different way. And so it was honestly an intentional shift for me that I'm embracing different qualities of not having all the answers and being collaborative and trying to be empathetic. So yes, Chris, I think ego can come from insecurities and other things like that. But I also think it might be just maybe maturing is the wrong word, but a choice or intention on how we want to show up. And some people haven't chosen that or won't chosen that or just haven't found it yet.
So, all right, we know how to detect it, I guess, right? At this point, we made up a scale of how you can sort of chart yourself on this thing. So what are some strategies, I guess, then for how do you how do you work on dialing it in? What are some things that you can do? I mean, it's not enough to just say, oh, be self-aware, right? Like it's not
I have to say, I don't think it's always about dialing it in. I would
okay.
say I see more people who need to dial it up, quite frankly.
All right.
So I see some really analytical, really smart people that know their shit, pardon my French, who don't believe in themselves enough and don't speak up enough and don't look for opportunities to join podcasts or go and speak at conferences or what have you. And it's holding them back in their careers. So not having enough of an ego is as much of a barrier as having too much.
All
It's
right.
finding that
So
sort of healthy balance, I think.
so you're not at the right point on the scale. Let's just say that
Yep.
you acknowledge I'm not at the right point in the scale. How do you change that? What do you do? Right? Because you can't change your personality, right? Just to suit a given situation.
Well, we can certainly start by changing our behaviors, right? So we can say, hold on here. I think, and there's lots of ways that having, an inflated or an improper sense of self can cause us to engage in bad behaviors, right? If we think we've got to do something unethical in order to maintain status, for example, that would be a bad behavior. If we think that we have to talk bad about a client or talk bad about a coworker because that inflates our attitude, if we find ourselves doing that, then we know that we've got this dialed in wrong and there are things we could do. So I think a thing, Chris, to answer your question specifically, and I know this is something we're just trying to make sure we share this with the folks who are listening, is how does your audience react to you, right? How are your coworkers reacting to you? How are your clients reacting to you? How might others who are hearing your voice react to you? And if the reaction is one where they're standing away, or someone, you hear people muttering that they think you're a jerk or that they feel that you're difficult to work with, that might be the indication you need to say, hold on a second. First off, let me slow down a little bit, right? Let's not get in the middle of these things and think I've got to show up with the answer. Let's make sure voices are heard so that I am not thinking that my idea is so good that no one else's ideas should be considered. I think that is a good start. Slow down is a good start.
Is this something that can be coached to somebody else?
Well, I wanted to leave that with that idea that you could begin with, and let everybody jump in on this. But if we start with the behaviors, we can get our mind back into place. We can get our mind to align with our behaviors, I think. But the thing that starts off as the problem is the behavior. So if we are in fact finding ourselves ready to coach someone else, an employee, a coworker, or something like that, we could say, hold on a second. When so-and-so talks to you, they've said that they don't feel like they're being heard. Do you think there's something you could do differently in that situation that would help them feel like their ideas, that there's some input?
I want to challenge something that I think Christy said just now, which is you can't change your personality. Now, of course, that to an extent is true, but there is this concept of a kind of natural style and then a style that you may flex into. And I think what I've learned to do reasonably well in my career is understand who I am naturally and my kind of natural tendencies, but then learn to flex and adapt the way I might approach a situation based on the context. And I think that is something you can get better at doing. I think, as I talked about earlier on, I was very good sort of individual contributor, but didn't have that empathy, didn't have the ability to sort of flex according to the situation. And I think it is possible. I'm not saying it's easy. And I'm not saying it's comfortable. It certainly will be uncomfortable because it won't be natural. But you can get better at stuff if you want to apply yourself and you want to kind of grow, then that is possible.
Yeah, I love this idea, right, of having fake personalities.
It shouldn't be fake. It shouldn't be fake, right? It shouldn't be fake, right? It's a version of yourself. You're just dialing up something or dialing down something. Right. Is the way I look at it.
Wait! I got your motto for this, Chris. It's sincerity now. So act sincere. Sincerity now. Not serenity.
Go.
Sincerity now.
All right. So I guess the question is, it's like, all right, so Oliver, let's go down that path for a second, right? Let's say you acknowledge that, like, geez, in some situations, I've read the room and I'm out of sync, right, with what's going on. how do we, or I don't know if this is for anyone really. It's like, how do we lay out a improvement plan, right? How do we hold ourselves accountable for sort of moving the needle on our ability to adapt to the situations, and our ability to read the room, and our ability to empathize and be self-aware? Because that sounds like it's a journey, right? It sounds like that's a lot of work to get there.
It does take work.
Make that happen and hold ourselves accountable to it? It sounds like a weight loss program, right? It's like, I'll start my diet tomorrow.
It is, but in all honesty, it's much like we sort of touched on before. The kind of emotional intelligence side of the consulting gig is like a superpower. If you manage to master this thing, it makes you very adaptable and flexible. And so it is worth going through that weight loss program equivalent effort and getting a good coach, getting a good mentor to kind of help you. Because I think to start with, it's getting someone to call you out. So obviously not in the moment, unless that's an appropriate thing to do, but like afterwards say, hey, did you realize, Oliver, that you were talking over Whynde again? Because you do it all the time. and for me, a silly little technique was just start writing something down instead of like blurting out, like, verbal diarrhea, my point. Just write it down, Oliver. And now I just take mental notes, right? And sometimes I will still write things down, because I was dominating in meetings. I was talking way too much, like I dominate podcasts, and so
I have to cut so much out.
Yeah, you do. It's terrible.
Phil, I know you run Mastermind, right, on this, right? So
yeah,
what are some ways to hold people, yourself, accountable, or maybe have others help hold you accountable for improvement?
Yeah, well, you know what? I like that, what you just brought in there, because I think that's part of it too, right? So first off, we started with the idea that it's best to be working on yourself and be an exemplar in this. You want other people to be good at it, be a good exemplar, right? Be a good example for people to figure that kind of thing out. And then, of course, we gave some ideas there, if for yourself, which again, I love the fact that Oliver just reinforced: slow down, write some notes down, don't talk so much, listen more. But I love the idea. I'm the question asking type. So rather than, as someone pointed out to me, rather than tell someone crazy, Phil will look at them and say, tell me more about that. Explain that to me. And I went a little further. It's like, I usually will go, okay, I'm confused. Help me understand that. But the idea is to get these voices in and get people. And the other thing, to get to Chris's point again on this specifically, I think it is okay to look at somebody and say, listen, I'm really afraid I'm going to run over you on this conversation because I get excited, or because I got other bad behaviors. I want you to know it's okay to interrupt me. Just interrupt me. If you do not let me run on, Chris, do not let me run on.
I also think that part of the program is finding a role model or role models, so that you can also look at other people and how they show up in different ways, to give you, to realize there are other ways of leading or speaking and leading conversations that isn't just sort of the ego focus, right? So you can actually see it in action.
So that's a really good point. Do you have a really good example, Whynde, of someone that sort of, has the ideal id to ego balance, or whatever we're calling it on the scale?
Yeah,
is there a good role model you can think of?
I Desmond Tutu, but I'm not kidding. Actually, that's definitely a role model for me. But I just think about quiet leaders, like Scandinavian leaders. Actually, that I think is a really good role models for me. Even looking at people in the government and how they show up, they're very poised. They're very sort of quiet, wise leadership.
Yeah, I think finding folks can be challenging, right? But there's some people that we think are thoughtful. They are accumulating data and acting decisively, but not with an inflated sense of self. Again, that inflated sense of self, we can all see it. We all know it when we see it, I think, in others anyway.
Is this where you remind us about Marcus Aurelius? Was he in check? Did he have his ego in check?
I think that's a great question, right? And of course, yes, I'm always thinking about Marcus Aurelius, what he might have said or how he did. But I mean, this was somebody who spent a bunch of time trying to make, who was surrounded by people with all sorts of inflated sense of self-importance, right? He was surrounded by senators and generals and other leaders. And, this was a thing that he himself was trying to say, wait a second, how do I balance this out? How can I take this advice in and deal with it in a honorable manner? He was trying hard to deal, but remember, he reminded himself that he was going to be surrounded, Meditations 2:1, he talks about at the very beginning, right, about all of the people that you're going to find yourself. I mean, they're going to be cranky people and angry people and people who are going to tell you things that aren't true and all of this kind of stuff. And you're just going to have to listen and realize that they do this because they've not thought about this as hard as you, right? And now I'm going to say, this is a thing that I think of for myself. It's like, there are times when I think I've got this dialed in pretty good and I'm surrounded by people who aren't. And I think they're just not thinking about this right now. And sometimes I wonder, are they scared? What might they be afraid of? Is there something I could help them with on that regard? But they're acting in a way that's not honorable or useful in the moment. But again, they're telling me something about themselves. The question is, am I listening?
Maybe they don't care. Maybe they don't care in the moment.
Quite probably they don't. But again, not caring is an example of something that's not quite right to begin with, right?
It's like that emotional brain versus logical brain thing. But the point I was going to make is I actually think the harder thing is how to deal with people that are presenting ego. I think, if you can work on yourself, and that's cool, but often it's how do you deal with egotistical leaders that just aren't listening or are incredibly difficult to work with or are making the workplace somewhat toxic. Or they're winding up the client or something like that. I think that's the far harder challenge than, in my experience, than working on yourself.
Reacting
Yeah.
to, how do you react to, the guy that gets on the meeting and talks for the full hour and like nobody else can talk, right? Like,
sure. So someone suggested, when we talked about this morning, someone suggested doing a values check. Which I thought was pretty useful. And I've done this in other situations, but when someone's run away, I say, okay, I hear what you're saying, and I'm not sure I understand where we're headed. So help me understand again what you think is important to have happen here. What are you trying to get to? What do you want to get done? An ideal outcome looks like what? And by the way, I know I'm saying the same thing 4 or 5 times. I'm doing that to give them time to calm down and to think about it. And it's intentional on my part to ask this multiple ways so they can find a hook and slide in comfortably to answer the question.
I think that's always a challenge, right? Especially if you are not as poised as what you're just describing, right? But you're also sitting there like, I've got to say the thing. I've got to get my thought out. I got to get my thought, right? You're not thinking about how do I deal with the person that's acting this. It's like a ego to ego match, right? And it's I think that's
worst case. A deadly embrace of egos is the worst case. We talked about ego in others. We talked about ego in self. We did not talk about how, when we're leading a team, we might help the team figure that out among themselves, right? So you may have to intervene in a team because you got someone crushing someone else. And the question is, how do you help a team get this dynamic figured out? And I just, again, as a consultant, you're almost never working alone, right? You're with other people. Is that interesting? If not, just skip it and cut out Phil. That's all good.
I think it's interesting.
Okay.
We can add that in. Does anyone else want to say anything about teams and that dynamic? I mean, we've all led teams, right?
And they can be combative. They can fight in a variety of ways. And the question is, how do you intervene? And again, you may never have to use the word ego when dealing with this, right? But you can see that what's happening is someone feels in every team, every player, particularly the ones whose ego is out of check, overvalues their contribution. And in overvaluing their contribution, they create a tension on the team that you're trying to figure out how to resolve. My question to you, people who are spending time thinking about this or having to intervene, how do you intervene when people overvalue their contribution?
Well, I'll just jump in with a couple thoughts here. in situations like this, I always think it is best to head it off before it happens. And so when we put together a team or on a project or whatever it is that we're doing, I think just starting up front with the right set of principles on how we're going to act, on our values as a team, and as our North Star for what success is, which is hopefully something bigger than each individual, so that it sort of transcends those little bit, those egos. So again, I think we try to head it off, but when we do have those, that person who is maybe overvaluing their contribution, honestly, I think this comes down to relationships and openness, and the leader and or team members just being open to feedback and to giving feedback in the moment, and helping people understand why that's maybe detrimental to that person and to the team.
I think that's great. And Phil's working on the team building the ego of the dog.
I'm team building with the puppy. He was started to bark as Whynde was talking. Apparently, he liked what she had to say. So now he's resting.
That's awesome. So all right, final thoughts on ego in the workplace. We've touched on a lot of different areas, right? It's like, I love this idea of, it's not necessarily a negative thing, right? It's matching the way you act and think and listen and react, matching that to the given scenario, right? And Oliver, your point earlier, I think was great. There's plenty of people that have too little ego, right, for a given situation, that need to bump it up a notch, right? So, I mean, I love this. I think it fits with a lot of the things that we've talked about over time. I think it's particularly challenging to do for consultants, because I think certainly in a lot of roles, you as a consultant, your brain's getting pumped full of like, you're the only one that consult you. It's like only you can do this, right? And whether that's true or not, I think it's a lot of people go around, especially in management consulting, with sort of that look in their eye, right? Like, I'm the man. I got this under control. I don't know. That's my final thought on it. Phil, what are you thinking?
Nope. I think that's right. And getting this the thing is, so I'm hoping that us talking about this caused some folks to think about, okay, let me be more sensitive to when this might be out of sorts in a team or in an environment, and get it back into sorts, because we want a safe, productive, supportive environment to work in with others, right? So I think giving ourselves some sensitivity to it, and then we've given some basic ideas on how you might, intervene in something like that, both in yourself and with others. So I think we're in a good spot.
Love it. Oliver?
I think this touches on the things we've talked about before, like psychological safety, making sure that that's present in a team, so that people can be themselves. They don't feel they have to then act up. And yeah, exactly what you were saying earlier, Chris, about sometimes you need to dial it up, sometimes you need to dial it down. It's difficult as a consultant. You need to react quite quickly to a new client situation often. And often there are situations where you're doing just in time learning, right? Let's be honest. Sometimes you'll put in an engagement and you don't know all the things that perhaps you'd like to know about the thing that you're being asked to do. And the ego can then sometimes come out then, because you're bluffing and you're having to sort of cover over the fact you don't really know perhaps all the things that would be good if you did know. So yeah, it's a complex one, but I think being aware of it is the first step, and then helping others with their challenges in this space is the second step.
And not to inflate her ego, but the greatest expert in the room, Whynde, what are your thoughts?
On definitely not on ego. I really like where we've landed here with this idea of adaptation and sort of balancing and fitting into the situations. My last thought is, I think it's good to be open to different styles of leadership and adopting new traits. There's a book called The Athena Doctrine, and it highlights that the need for feminine traits of leadership in this century, and I'm not trying to make this man woman, it's just the idea of feminine traits like candor and connectedness and humility and empathy and openness and balance. And so I just think when we think about what does a different leadership style look like, that is, quietly strong and wise, it just reminds us that we can still get results in different ways, and also maybe in a way that's better balanced for ourselves and other people.
Love it. I mean, if I had an inflated sense of ego, I would say I think we touched on everything in the topic area.
We were so good.
We were so good.
So good.
The best.
The best.
No ego here. Sorry.
Listen, guys, I appreciate it. So thank you, Phil, Whynde, Oliver. I'm Chris Lockhart. Don't forget to subscribe and like, and see all our new stuff when it comes out. All right.
Because I'm really important.
Oh, wait, you should have zoomed in on yourself at the end to do that, right? I don't get to, because the best ideas come from Chris.
Watch all my content.
Right. Right.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Phil Yanov, Whynde Kuehn, Oliver Cronk. I am Chris Lockhart.
The best
at this, and you should subscribe and like to just about everything I have to say is of immense value. So there we go. There's Phil. He's got some value too. All right, guys, listen, appreciate it.
Yeah, it's fun.
Talk to everybody.
I don't think I got enough talk time on that one.
I'm gonna have a tantrum about that now. I'm gonna bang the table.